talk, I want to share findings from my doctoral research on flood governance in Indonesia. Now I'm working as a researcher at the Research Center for Politics in the National Research and Innovation Agency, BRIN. Yeah, when I first started my PhD, honestly, I knew almost nothing about floods. I didn't even know what a polder was or pumping station or water tunnel, etc., etc. But one day in Semarang, one of my observed cities, while standing in a muddy water, a frontline officer told me, we know actually how to fix the flooding, but the factory next door removed the retention pond. So nobody dares to stop them, not even the mayor. That short conversation changed everything for me at the time. So it made me realize that floods are not only caused by heavy rain or broken pipes, they're also talking about power, politics, and who gets to decide what the city looks like. So why I took floods as my PhD project, because flooding is the most frequent and damaging disaster in Indonesia. So every year, hundreds of cities are flooded and millions of people are affected. For many Indonesians, living with water is kind of a way of life, but being safe from floods has increasingly become a privilege. What makes this troubling is that Indonesia has spent billions of flood infrastructure, and yet some cities keep sinking while others manage to stay dry. So in the left picture, it's kind of headline from one of the biggest newspaper in this country. So the headline is kind of the cities that will be sinking in the future. So most of the coastal areas uh, confront inevitable danger if there is no significant policy changes. So this puzzle, this puzzle become my core question of my PhD. Why do some Indonesian cities manage floods better than others, even though they face similar challenge and use the same national policies? And even more puzzling, in some cases, cities that invest more in large infrastructure actually perform less successful. So to answer this question, I applied a comparative subnational research design, combining quantitative indicators with in-depth qualitative fieldwork. Cases were selected based on flood frequency, rainfall intensity, number of people affected, and geographical contact, allowing comparison among cities with similar exposure but very different outcomes. So there are four localities, and all of them in Java, not because Perry Chiking, because I want to study about cities in Java, but based on those indicators, the historical trajectory shows that many cities in Java is highly exposure with floods. But in the last 15 or 10 years, the trend are quite varied, because some of cities experience uh, impressive performance of flood management, which showed by less frequency of flood cases and then less number of affected people. But then some cities shows the different picture, provide showing more less successful picture with a higher frequency of flood cases and higher number of affected people. So I took four cities that has a long history of flooding, and until today, as you can see in four pictures, they are endangered with many flood risk areas, but the outcomes is very different. Surabaya has been largely flood free in recent years despite modest budget. And Semarang invest millions, yet flooding continue to worsen. Bandung keeps building infrastructure, but floods remain persistent. And lastly, Bojonegoro once flooded almost everywhere, but now is nationally recognized for significantly reducing the number of people affected. Yeah, as you can see, so I compare two main indicators, the flood cases and the number of affected people. And from the flood cases, we know that Semarang and Bandung are the two cities that showing less successful of flood outcomes, that showing by the increasing trend of flood cases. And the opposite side, the Surabaya and Bojonegoro, showing a more successful trend with lower cases of flood incidents. So these findings are grounded in 2 years of intensive field work. So I shadowed frontline officers, drainage officers. I joined inspection with them and interviewed more than 120 officials, activists, academics, expert, consultant, journalists, and etc. etc. And also mapped hundreds of flood projects and land use change using the GIS. I spent a lot of time with communities who told me they felt powerless because decisions about their neighborhood safety were made in political meetings they could never enter. So my key arguments are most dominant flood policy models, including those promoted by international organizations, especially ADB, treat flooding as a technical problem, build higher dikes, dig deeper tunnels, install bigger pumps. But my research shows that flood risk management is deeply political. This study employs a political economy approach to argue that variation in flood risk management outcomes across Indonesian cities is primarily shaped by local political dynamics rather than technical capacity or policy design. A central factor is entrenched politico-business collusion, which systematically undermines flood policies by weakening enforcement, distorting regulation, and compromising emergency response system. So where collusion is prevalent, investment in infrastructure and preparedness simply do not reduce flood risk. So to look what exactly happened on the ground, the study focus on three core elements of flood risk management, which are flood defense, flood prevention, and flood preparation. So I follow the EU Flood Directive 2007 because now this framework adopted by ADB to translate to implemented in many developing countries and including Indonesia to address the flood problem. In Indonesia, these are the most prominent and operational component of flood risk management at the local level. National regulations explicitly prioritize drainage infrastructure, spatial planning, and emergency response with decentralizing significant authority to local government. Flood defense, concerns how drainage systems, canals, pumps, and retention ponds are constructed and enforced. Flood prevention concerns how land use decisions protect or undermine water catchment areas and green zones. Flood preparation concerns how early warning system, evacuation, and emergency response are organized when floods occur. Importantly, all cities operate under the same national regulatory framework for these three elements. But as I have mentioned before, the outcomes differ dramatically. It is precisely within this decentralization space where local governments translate national rules into everyday practice that variation emerge. These three elements therefore allow us to observe how politics enters flood governance in concrete and observable ways through the enforcement, through spatial decision, and through emergency coordination. So let me now to turn to each of these elements, starting with flood defense. Flood defense is often assumed to be the most technical component of flood risk management. It involves drainage system, canals, pump station, and retention ponds. Formally, the rules governing flood defense are clear across all Indonesian cities. Developers or big property companies are required to construct retention ponds, and industries have to maintain drainage system. However, during my fieldwork in Semarang and Bandung, I repeatedly encountered a different reality. Large housing complex and industrial facilities had reduced, relocated, or entirely removed retention ponds to maximize the usable land. These were not hidden violations. Engineers, inspectors, and frontline officers were fully aware that drainage capacity had been compromised, yet enforcement rarely followed. When I asked why sanctions were not imposed, officials did not cite a lack of technical knowledge or legal authority. Instead, they referred to political constraint. Many of these developers were closely connected to political elites through campaign financing, informal networks, or long-standing business relations. As a result, local government hesitate to enforce regulation. Drainage system that appeared adequate on paper failed in practice because key components were missing. By contrast, in Surabaya, enforcement worked differently. Here, enforcement was not driven by bureaucratic courage alone, but by strong public oversight. Civil society organizations, neighborhood groups, and local media actively monitored drainage violation. Complaints were reported, circulated, and amplified through platforms such as local radio and social media. This public visibility made collusion harder to sustain. In several occasions, when I joined the inspection, even wealthy developers were required to comply. Retention bonds were treated as non-negotiable obligations, even for wealthy companies or big men. Violations were corrected. Officials repeatedly emphasized that ignoring violations would quickly become a public issue. So the key lesson here is infrastructure effectiveness depends less on engineering sophistication than on enforcement capacity and political will. Yeah, flood prevention shift attention upstream to spatial planning and land use. On paper, all cities design protected areas, green zones, and water catchment areas within their spatial plans. But in practice, spatial planning emerged as one of the most politically contested arena of flood governance. In Semarang and Bandung, I traced land use change over time using spatial data and field observation. What emerged was a pattern of gradual but systematic conversion of water catchment areas into housing estates, industrial zones, and commercial developments. Each permit appeared technical and incremental, but over time, these permits accumulated and systematically weakened the city's natural flood protection. This was not simply a planning failure. It reflected power struggles over land, driven by pressures from developers and facilitated by collusive relationship between political and business actors. Where civil society oversight was weak, these conversions proceed with little resistance. But again, when I went to Surabaya, a different trajectory. Here, civil society organization, neighborhood groups, and local media actively monitored land use decisions. When formal planning process failed, residents mobilized through protests, litigation, and media exposure. I describe this dynamic as insurgent planning. Flood prevention succeeds not merely because of plan exists, but because citizens are able to contest land use decisions and hold authorities accountable. Flood preparation concerns early warning system, evacuation, and emergency response. This is the domain where political leadership and autonomy become most visible. In Bojonegoro, flood preparedness improved significantly under leadership that was relatively independent from entrenched elite coalitions. This political autonomy allowed local leaders to form direct partnerships with community organizations, volunteers, and local media. Early warning informations travel quickly, evacuation procedures were clear and widely trusted. Communities were treated as active participants rather than passive victims. Flooding still occurred, but the number of people affected declined sharply. Surabaya shows a similar pattern. Here, flood preparation is embedded in everyday governance. Political leaders were able to mobilize bureaucratic agencies, neighborhood units, and volunteers without excessive political interference. Emergency response benefited from strong coordination and public trust. But in contrast, Semarang exhibit a fragmented system. Emergency mechanism exist formally, but coordination was slow and uneven. Political leaders were embedded in the dense elite networks, limiting their autonomy to prioritize public safety over political considerations. As a result, response were reactive and less effective. Flood preparation therefore depends not only on technical capacity or coordinative, but on political autonomy and state-society alliances. So the central theoretical contribution of these studies to show why flood risk management tools often fail, even when they are technically sound. By bringing political economy into flood governance, this research demonstrates that flood management outcomes are shaped by enforcement, collusion, and state-society relations rather than by infrastructure alone. This insight challenge dominant techno-managerial approach that treat governance as a coordination problem rather than a political process. Floods are not simply technical failures, they are political outcomes. The Indonesian cases show that similar instruments can produce sharply different results depending on the local political dynamics. So the policy implications are clear. Flood management cannot rely on infrastructure alone. It must prioritize enforcement, accountability, and public oversight. Anti-corruption efforts, campaign finance reform, and civil society monitoring are not peripheral to climate adaptation. They are central to it. And also, lastly, international flood programs must move beyond engineering templates and incorporate political analysis into the project design. Lastly, to conclude, flooding, it's not only a hydrological event, it is a reflection of how power, space, and risk are governed. Achieving what I call just flood governance requires more than technical expertise. It requires political courage, democratic accountability, and inclusive governance. So the politics of drive it is ultimately about justice, who is protected and who is left exposed. Thank you. Yeah, if many of you curious with the writings, articles, chapters, or books that I produce through this PhD project or previously, can check to my website, the personal website. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yogi. It was really nice to hear about this research. And I just wanted to know if that was you with the photo with the vest and the face mask. Was that you also? No, it was hard to
No,
see.
it's the frontline officer that I
Okay.
followed. Yeah, part of
All
the
right.
method.
Prepared for anything. Excellent. Good. So I think that, I really appreciate that you're pointing to the fact that there's some background noise. Okay, thank you. Just that you're pointing to that, it is not a technical problem, right? That this sort of is socially constructed. It's a political problem. It's something that is coming from the way that we organize societies, and above all, the way that power, the structures of power. And so I thought that I would reflect a little bit also from the perspective of that I'm coming from thinking a lot about maladaptation and what causes maladaptation, because what we see, I think what you demonstrated, we could probably call maladaptation some of these building more infrastructure, yet not actually addressing the problem and potentially even creating more problems. I mean, without knowing the complete details, like I wouldn't put the label on it necessarily. But I think what's interesting is over the years, it's become quite clear to me that we have in this increasing number of voices that work on climate change adaptation in particular, but also some coming from the disaster risk reduction field, I would say there seems to be this sort of split, and I'm not sure that we can even see that there's a continuum here. It's more like a different perspectives. One where I would say we see a much more kind of techno-optimistic, instrumentalist perspective that says, you know, infrastructure and technology and those kinds of things can solve the problem, but also have sort of a checklist mentality that we just need to do X, Y, Z, and then we'll be able to achieve, you know, reduce flood risk. And on that side, I think we can hear also a lot of echoes in the climate change UN Framework Convention negotiations along the lines of global goal and adaptation, which to some extent is also a set of indicators, and look, we've achieved adaptation. We might even see that with the Sendai framework, but let's just stick more to being really critical of the adaptation stuff. Then on the other side, we have critical voices that are pushing occasionally very vocally for transformational approaches that are looking at the root causes of the problems, that are looking at vulnerability, that are looking at the politics, that are looking at sort of seeing the power struggle, seeing justice as a critical dimension. And that is absolutely a political perspective. It's saying, you know, we cannot look at adaptation without recognizing that there are politics in there. And like I said, from I'm not sure that there is a continuum here. I think there's somehow don't really connect anywhere because if you have one perspective, then it's hard to understand the other. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, in looking at maladaptation, we see that infrastructure tends to be one of the biggest drivers of maladaptation, partly because once you construct it, you're not likely to be able to tweak it very easily. You can't change things very easily, right? It's sort of, especially coastal protection. I mean, once it's there, yeah, it's there. But also that's kind of technical focus is in a sense much easier, right? Because then we don't put the blame on the politicians. We don't have to do research on who's actually being corrupt, and we don't have to look into these things. But what apart from that it's easier and it avoids these kind of difficult encounters or difficult confrontations, where does it come from? And I feel like I have a strong sense that a lot of this is also coming from the kind of knowledge that we are producing around flood risk management, around climate change, around disasters in general, where we have an extremely strong, there's a knowledge hierarchy where we have the kind of, engineering, natural sciences coming at the top, and then the rest of us, social scientists working with qualitative data. Let's not even talk about the humanities. There is this clear hierarchy of which kind of knowledge counts, and you can see this, for example, in the IPCC, where it's very clear what kind of narrative dominates. It's the narrative that says we have climate change impacts, and then we have to address the problem, and then we have, maybe some kind of solution at the end, rather than recognizing that the solution can also be part of the problem from the beginning, right? And so I appreciate that you use the word courage, because I think courage is precisely what's needed, and not just from the civil society actors that you were talking about, the sort of civil society mobilization that was so critical in some of these cases. But in fact, as scholars, we also need to have courage, because we need to be able to push back against these dominant knowledge hierarchies that end up still making these kinds of technical solutions come to the top, because all the other stuff is too difficult to deal with. And so I think I've been in enough different kinds of projects, and I would say even IPCC is one example for me, where you think that it's enough just to say equity and justice. These are things that matter. But for many people who don't even work on the ground with people, who don't engage with civil society, who don't know the politics of daily management of flood risk, for example, who don't, or, you know, for whom it can't be possible that one factory can dominate, or one big elite can dominate, because that's not the kind of thing that comes on their radar. It is really difficult for them to understand, how would one take on a justice lens? How would one recognize the role of politics? And isn't it just activist to talk about politics, right? And so I think that there are, now I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I do think that we're at a kind of crossroads where the sort of interdisciplinarity has hit, I think, some kind of challenge or wall, where we almost need to find a way to educate more about reflexivity, and try to kind of get people who are very, let's say, techno-optimistic, or who are very enamored by infrastructure and so on, to somehow also take a step back and reflect a little bit about possible adverse consequences. And I think that, you know, we could see also the politics being negative, right? In the sense that the politicians, if you take it from that perspective, the politicians have much shorter cycles that they think on, because they're worried about the next election, or they're not so worried about, you know, what's happening in 10 years, because maybe they'll be retired then and living on Lombok and, you know, and enjoying something else. But I think that kind of the bigger picture politics is obviously is beyond just the politicians themselves. And I think we need to consider a little bit this also, like where are the places where you can mobilize. And I think you showed nicely also where the kind of things that seem to work, the things that don't really work. And I guess what maybe to round this off, I would probably also ask you if you can talk a little bit about to what extent you think there might be kind of social cultural dimensions that could influence how these different approaches were taken up. If you could see any kind of, you know, could you see the same types of measures everywhere, or are there any kind of peculiarities of each case that add to kind of maybe even facilitate making things more difficult, or sorry, I should rephrase that, that provide a recipe for increased flood risk because of, I don't know, complexities, a lot of corruption, or so on? Or is there anything else that you think, you know, could there be some lessons that could be learned across that could really kind of, that could work? Or could there be general lessons, but it's unlikely that each place is going to take them up because they already have some kind of social cultural or other kinds of barriers that might prevent them from being integrated? That would be one question for me. Yes, and I think maybe I'll just stop there, because that's a big enough question also. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lisa, for your comments. It's very insightful, and I'm happy to hear some insight from you. And I'd like to address one question from you. It's about is there any kind of factors, yeah, to influence the variation in terms of like the success, the success, a failure of success from the flood risk management, or the active or passive of the civil society actors, right? So yeah, I think this is very interesting question, because when we learn with the successful cities like Surabaya, we can go to the historical, political, economy factors. Because first, Surabaya is one of the big cities in Indonesia that has various economic activities. So the people do not heavily rely on the state funds, so they can they can live independently without live in the big patronage network, because the context in Indonesia, many politicians who elected in the public office will use patronage network, right? To tame the resistance and then to setting their own agenda. And it would be very easy for them if they uh, rule in a in kind of cities or places that many people relies only on the state funds. It's different in Surabaya because Surabaya it's kind of a port city. So historically, uh, we can see many various economic activities there. So the local media can serve as a watchdog because different with the media that live in a city that depend on the state funds, because the media will just only praise the works from the government and so on and so forth. But with the in Surabaya, because the media can manage their funds independently from the people from business sectors and so on and so forth, they can still criticize the performance from the public sectors. And also from the historical side, we can see that Surabaya this is very an interesting city also, and mostly applied in the some cities in Java, because we know Surabaya is kind of historically speaking is one of the epicenter, the gravitation center of colonial movement. So we can see many movement with the labor movement, union movement, anti-colonial movement, and Surabaya it's also the heart, the main the one of the uh, biggest supporters for the leftists. So after for the context who not familiar with the Indonesian politics, so after 65, the elected leaders did the program or the violence to the one of the biggest one of the biggest leftist party in Asia at that time, and one of the city that become the heart of the supporters was Surabaya. So historically speaking, political economy speaking, people in Surabaya could be uh, very critical toward people who are ruling in power. And when I talk about civil society, it's not because it's not of the activists. It's goes to the uh, grassroots people, go to the ordinary people, because with the local media there, they build kind of compliance system that articulate every protest, every report from the public to the government. So because of this noisy publics, so not just only rely on NGO or GSO, but because of this noisy public that very criticize with the flood problem, and then every elected leaders don't have any choice to follow the aspiration and every public demands, because due to the consequence of direct election, they have to build a good image to attract sympathy and then to get votes. So I think that's the answer for Professor Lisa question. But also, I add something. Also, I'm very interesting with the maladaptation, yeah, because one of the interesting example is like many big project in Semarang, because Semarang now it's kind of location for the pilot project for the polder system. So many Dutch engineers who went to Semarang and facilitated by some donor agency and cooperate with local government to build this kind of polder system. But the problem is because this polder system, they close the river in the estuaries. So it makes that because of now the sea level is rising, so they close the estuary with a very big dike, and they put pumping machine. And but the problem is, so when the rainfall came, it's kind of put the destiny of the Semarang people into the pumping machine, right? Because it's like one river just only have maybe 5 or 6 pumping machines. So if this pumping machines broken, so the river flowing is easily to be happen. So that situation that happens mostly because many of the polder system do not have a good maintenance. But then it attracts further question about the corruption because every year in every pumping machine they already give by the local government kind of maybe 5 billion rupiah or or maybe 1,000 euros to as a budget to maintain the system, but it always fail. So you know, I think this is part of the maladaptation, right? Because many people think that once the infrastructure built, so the problem will be over. But we see that now when the infrastructure installed, the problem it still reoccurred until today. So this so my field work detected that the effectiveness of the flood infrastructure is not only about the quality of the machine, the solidness of the concrete, but how to manage people who operate behind this system.